The first sound I heard in the courtroom wasn't the judge's voice, it was laughter. My husband leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, and whispered, calm and certain, "Relax, this is over." His tone wasn't angry or cruel. It was worse than that. It was final. As if the outcome had already been signed, stamped, and filed before we ever took our seats. His mistress laughed softly beside him. Not nervously, not accidentally. She laughed like someone who had already packed for a trip she knew she was taking. A few heads turned. Someone in the gallery shifted, uncomfortable, then looked away. The sound hung in the air longer than it should have. I kept my eyes down. Not because I was ashamed, and not because I was afraid. I did it because I knew something they didn't, and I didn't want to give it away too soon. The judge opened the file. Paper slid against paper. Pages turned, then nothing, no comment, no immediate reaction, just silence. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels heavy, like something is about to fall. They didn't notice, not yet. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and recycled air. The benches were hard, the lighting unforgiving. Everything about the room was designed to strip emotion away and leave only facts behind. That was why I had chosen this place to finally stop pretending. My husband sat straight, shoulders relaxed, one arm resting casually along the back of his chair. He looked comfortable, almost bored. He had the posture of someone who believed he had already won. His lawyer leaned in occasionally, whispering reassurances, nodding along to a script they had clearly rehearsed. Behind him, his family filled an entire row. His mother sat in the center, hands folded neatly in her lap, face composed. She didn't look at me once. His sister leaned forward, whispering something that made his mistress smile again. They were unified, certain, confident. I sat alone. No hand on my shoulder, no murmured encouragement, no sympathetic glances, just me, my chair, and the file the judge was still reading. I had expected the laughter. I had expected the whispers. I had expected the way they looked at me like I was an inconvenience that would be resolved by lunch. What I hadn't expected, oddly enough, was how calm I felt. I wasn't here to convince anyone of my pain. I wasn't here to perform heartbreak or demand sympathy. That phase of my life was already over. The judge shifted slightly, adjusting his glasses as he continued reading. His brow creased, just for a moment, then smoothed again. It was subtle. Almost nothing. But I saw it. My husband didn't. His mistress crossed her legs and glanced at her phone, then caught herself and slid it back into her bag with a smirk. She looked like someone waiting for a curtain to fall, ready for applause. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The clerk called the case number. Our names echoed in the room, formal and detached, stripped of everything they once meant to me. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a record, a sequence of decisions, a timeline of choices that had finally reached a place where they could no longer be rewritten. My husband's attorney stood first. He spoke smoothly, confidently, painting a picture of reason and fairness. He talked about an amicable separation, about moving forward, about how emotions had complicated things unnecessarily. He never said my name directly. He didn't have to. I was the implication. I watched my husband as his story was told for him. He nodded at the right moments, sighed softly when expected. He knew his role. He had practiced it. When the attorney finished, the judge didn't respond right away. He glanced down at the file again, turning back a few pages, then forward. He paused on something, read it twice. That was when my husband finally noticed. His smile faltered, just slightly, like a crack in glass that only appears when the light hits it at the wrong angle. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgent. The lawyer nodded, still calm, still confident. The judge looked up. For the first time since the hearing began, the room felt different. The air shifted. The laughter was gone. Even the benches seemed to hold their breath. I didn't look up right away. I had learned over a long and painful stretch of time that silence can be more powerful than any accusation. Let them wonder. Let them fill the gap with their own assumptions. I already knew how this moment would unfold. not because I could predict the exact words, but because I understood something they never had. They thought this hearing was about today. It wasn't. It was about every decision they had made when they believed no one was watching. Every shortcut, every quiet agreement, every time they assumed I was too small, too emotional, too dependent to matter. The judge cleared his throat. And in that moment, before a single sentence was spoken, I understood that everything they thought they knew about me was about to collapse. I stayed perfectly still. As I sat there waiting for the judge to speak, my mind slipped backward to a time when none of this existed, when my life felt solid and entirely my own. Before I married him, I knew exactly who I was. I had built a career I was proud of, one that paid my bills and gave me independence. I lived alone in a small apartment that reflected my taste and my habits. I chose my furniture carefully, my routines deliberately. Nothing in my life felt borrowed or temporary. I wasn't searching for rescue, and I wasn't lonely in the way people assume a single woman must be. I was steady, practical, confident in quiet ways that didn't need validation. Work mattered to me, not because it defined my worth, but because it reflected my discipline. I liked knowing I could handle my own problems. I liked not having to ask permission. My world wasn't glamorous, but it was balanced. And balance, I later learned, is something you don't appreciate until it's gone. I met him in a setting that was unremarkable, which is probably why it felt safe. There was no dramatic introduction, no grand gesture. We talked easily, like two people who spoke the same language. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to impress me with stories of power or influence, at least not then. What stood out was how normal he felt. Grounded. Capable. He spoke about his ambitions, but not in a way that demanded admiration. He spoke about partnership, about building something together, not about being carried or supported. When he complimented me, it wasn't about how I looked. It was about how I thought. I remember noticing that and thinking it meant something. At the beginning, he respected my boundaries. He didn't rush me. He didn't pressure me to rearrange my life for him. If I canceled plans, he didn't sulk. If I needed space, he gave it. It felt like mutual respect, like two adults choosing each other rather than clinging out of fear. He admired my work, asked about my projects, spoke about me to others with pride. I had no reason to doubt him, and I didn't go looking for reasons either. I wasn't naive, but I wasn't suspicious. I believed in taking people at face value when their actions supported their words. When I met his family, it was brief at first. Dinners, holidays, polite conversations that stayed on the surface. They were well-mannered, composed, and observant. I noticed the way they watched me, not critically, but carefully, as if measuring something invisible. At the time, I dismissed it as curiosity. I told myself families always take time to warm up. There was one comment, though, made by his mother over dessert, something about how strong women often struggle with compromise. She smiled when she said it, like it was a compliment. I smiled back and let it pass. Looking back, I realize how early the framing began. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't impulsive. We talked about it for months, about expectations, about finances, about where we wanted to be in 5 years. I believed we were aligning our lives, not rearranging them around one person's needs. I said yes because I wanted to, not because I felt pressured or uncertain. I believed marriage would add to my life, not absorb it. I believed partnership meant standing side by side, not one step behind. I didn't imagine myself disappearing inside the relationship. I didn't imagine my voice fading into the background of someone else's plans. There was nothing in him then that suggested that future. That's the part people don't understand when they ask why someone stays too long. It doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with comfort, with trust, with choices that feel reasonable in the moment. If I had been afraid, I would have walked away. If there had been obvious red flags, I would have paid attention. But there weren't. Not the kind people talk about later, when hindsight sharpens everything. I chose him freely, with clarity, with confidence. And that choice, the one I made while standing firmly on my own feet, would later be rewritten as weakness, used as evidence that I had always needed him more than he needed me. Sitting in that courtroom years later, I understood something I hadn't before. The woman I had been before my marriage wasn't gone. She hadn't vanished or been erased. She had simply been quiet for a long time, waiting. And she remembered everything. The first year of our marriage felt steady, almost reassuring in how ordinary it was. We settled into routines without much effort. Mornings overlapped, evenings synced when they could. We both worked, both contributed, both spoke openly about plans that still felt shared. I didn't feel smaller then. If anything, I felt anchored. Marriage hadn't changed who I was. It simply added another presence to my life, one I believed stood beside me, not in front of me. I kept my career, I kept my income, I kept my sense of direction. When people asked how married life felt, I told them it felt familiar in the best way, like nothing important had been taken from me. I believed that was proof we were doing something right. The shift didn't announce itself, it arrived quietly, dressed as practicality. He was offered an opportunity that demanded more of him, longer hours, more responsibility, more pressure. He framed it as temporary, something that would pay off for both of us in the long run. I listened, asked questions, weighed the options. None of it sounded unreasonable. What he needed from me, he said, was flexibility. Not sacrifice, not change, just understanding. I agreed without hesitation. Adjusting schedules didn't feel like surrender. It felt like partnership. I took on more at home. I rearranged my workdays when I could. I told myself this was what support looked like when you cared about someone's future as much as your own. The first compromise didn't hurt because it didn't feel like a loss. Soon after, we started talking about finances more seriously. Long-term planning, efficiency, simplifying things. It made sense to merge some accounts, he said, especially with his workload increasing. I hesitated briefly, not out of distrust, but habit. Independence had always mattered to me. He reassured me everything would be transparent, we were a team. I agreed again. The lines blurred slowly, not all at once. I still had access. I still knew what was happening mostly, but decisions started to be discussed after they were made, not before. He explained instead of consulted. I noticed the difference but didn't name it. Naming things makes them real, and I wasn't ready for that. His family became more present around that time. Advice came wrapped in concern. Suggestions disguised as support. They spoke about the demands on him, the pressure he was under, the importance of minimizing distractions. I was praised for being understanding, for not making things harder than they needed to be. I wanted to live up to that image. There was a moment, a small one, when his sister answered a question I had asked him. He didn't interrupt her, didn't correct her. He simply nodded and moved on. I felt something tighten in my chest, a subtle warning I pushed aside. Families have dynamics, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. The second sacrifice was bigger, though it didn't feel dramatic at the time. I passed on an opportunity at work that would have required travel and visibility. He needed stability at home, he said. Just for now. Just until things settled. I said yes again. He thanked me, told me how much he appreciated my support. His gratitude made the choice feel noble, even necessary. I believed we were investing in something shared, that this imbalance was temporary. But balance has a way of recalibrating itself without asking permission. I began to notice how often plans changed without my input, how decisions were presented as conclusions. When I questioned something, I was reassured instead of answered. He wasn't dismissive, he was calm, reasonable, confident in ways that made my concerns feel excessive. Marriage requires compromise, I reminded myself. This is normal, this is adulthood. I didn't realize I was learning to speak less. The house felt the same, but something in the air had shifted. Conversations ended sooner, explanations shortened. I found myself choosing silence over friction, telling myself that peace mattered more than precision. By the time I noticed how often my voice was missing from the conversation, it already felt familiar. Comfortable even. Like a habit I hadn't consciously formed. Looking back, I understand that nothing was taken from me all at once. It was offered back to me in smaller portions, framed as consideration, as love, as necessity. And I kept accepting those terms, believing I was still standing on equal ground long after the ground had started to tilt. I couldn't point to a single moment when things began to feel wrong. It was more like a quiet awareness that crept in without permission, a sense that something essential had shifted just enough to be noticed. The house was still the same, the routines mostly intact, but the conversations felt thinner, like they were missing weight. He answered questions without elaboration. He moved through rooms with purpose, rarely lingering. When I tried to reconnect, to ask how his day had gone, his responses came clipped and efficient, as if time itself had become a limited resource I no longer deserved access to. I told myself it was stress, work pressure, responsibility. I had watched his workload grow, watched him take on more than he used to. It made sense that he would pull inward. People do that when they feel overwhelmed. At least, that's what I told myself. His schedule stopped making sense before I was willing to admit it. Late nights became expected rather than explained. Dinners grew cold on the table more often than not. When I asked when he'd be home, the answers were vague. Not evasive exactly, just incomplete. One night, he didn't come home at all. There was no warning, no call, no message. I lay awake listening for the door, checking the time, convincing myself there was a reasonable explanation waiting just beyond my anxiety. When he finally walked in the next morning, he acted as if nothing unusual had happened. He showered, dressed, and left again without acknowledging the night before. I didn't press him. I told myself that if there had been something to say, he would have said it. His phone became an extension of his body, always within reach, always face down, notifications silenced, passwords changed. When I asked casually about it, not accusing, just curious, his reaction was sharp enough to catch me off guard. "Why are you checking up on me?" he asked, irritation flickering across his face. I hadn't been checking. But the accusation landed anyway. I found myself apologizing, explaining that I was just making conversation, just asking. He waved it off, the moment dismissed, but something had shifted. I was suddenly aware of how quickly my curiosity had been reframed as suspicion. I began watching myself more closely than I watched him. Money started moving differently too, not disappearing but rerouting. Expenses I didn't recognize appeared on statements. When I asked, he explained them away as necessary, temporary, handled. At the same time, household purchases were scrutinized more closely. I found myself justifying simple things, explaining why something was needed before I'd even been questioned. Financial conversations became tense without ever becoming arguments. He stayed calm, reasonable. I was the one who felt flustered, as if I were asking for too much simply by wanting clarity. His family noticed before I did, or perhaps they noticed and chose not to say anything. Comments started surfacing at gatherings, gentle suggestions about patience and understanding, about how demanding his role had become, about how important it was not to add pressure. They spoke as if they knew what was happening between us, as if the story had already been told. He never corrected them. There was a moment, standing in his mother's kitchen, when I realized he had been discussing me without me. Decisions I thought were private had been dissected and interpreted by people who weren't part of our marriage. I smiled through it, nodding, absorbing the advice as if it were well-intentioned rather than invasive. On the drive home, he said nothing. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before. I replayed conversations, examined my tone, questioned my expectations. Was I being unreasonable? Too sensitive? Was I imagining tension that wasn't there? To keep the peace, I stopped bringing things up. I chose silence because it felt safer than confrontation. Each unasked question felt like a compromise, one more small thing I could let go of to preserve what we had. The signs didn't disappear, they multiplied. I just stopped looking at them directly. I told myself that marriages have phases, that every partnership goes through periods of distance, that love doesn't always feel warm or easy. I didn't realize that by choosing not to see what was happening, I was teaching him how far he could go. By the time I understood that something was truly wrong, the truth was already moving closer, carrying consequences I couldn't yet see, but would soon be forced to face. I first noticed her name because I heard it too often. At the beginning, It slipped into conversation casually, without weight. He mentioned her in passing, usually in the context of work, usually paired with something efficient or necessary. She handled a situation well. She stayed late to fix a problem. She understood the pressure he was under. Her name came and went like a detail I wasn't supposed to focus on. So I didn't, not at first. He spoke about her differently than he spoke about anyone else at work. His tone changed, brightened in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. When he described her, he used words like capable and reliable, the same words he used to use when talking about me. I noticed the shift and immediately dismissed it. I told myself it was my imagination, that stress had made me sensitive. When he criticized me, it was subtle, not direct. Small comments about timing, about priorities, about how she just got things done without overthinking. I absorbed those comparisons quietly, shrinking my reactions to keep the peace. I didn't want to be the kind of wife who felt threatened by a colleague. I remember the moment I realized he had never once asked how I felt about her presence. He spoke about her as if my approval were irrelevant, as if the decision had already been made. That should have mattered more to me than it did. The first time I saw her, it wasn't planned. We ran into each other at a company event I hadn't been told much about. She approached with confidence, her smile easy, practiced. She shook my hand like we were equals, like she already knew where she stood. She knew my name. She knew details about our life, where we lived, how long we'd been married. The way she spoke suggested familiarity I hadn't granted. She thanked me for supporting him. Not for loving him, supporting him, as if my role had already been defined and filed away. He watched the interaction closely, his expression unreadable. I felt like I was being measured, not just by her, but by him. Like this was a test I hadn't known I was taking. After that, her presence grew harder to ignore. His family began mentioning her too, always positively, always in ways that centered him. How helpful she was, how committed, how she made things easier for everyone. The comments were never overtly cruel, but they carved out space for her while pushing me to the margins. I felt it every time a conversation continued without me. I started to feel like a guest in my own marriage. There were moments when I wanted to ask the question forming in my throat. The simple one, the honest one. Is there something I should know? I rehearsed it in my head, over and over, imagining calm responses, rational explanations. But I never asked. I told myself asking would make me look insecure, that it would validate the very fear I was trying to suppress. Silence, I thought, was safer than being accused of jealousy. He took my silence as permission. The moment I felt replaced didn't arrive with fireworks or confrontation. It arrived quietly, disguised as efficiency. He made a decision about a significant part of our life without consulting me, then mentioned, almost casually, that she had helped finalize it. He spoke as if that explained everything. I stood there listening, realizing that my opinion hadn't been forgotten. It had been bypassed. Her input had been valued more than my presence. That was when the truth finally settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't just about work. It wasn't just about proximity or shared hours. It was about hierarchy, about who mattered and who didn't. I didn't confront him then either. I told myself I needed proof, that reacting emotionally would only give him leverage. I stayed quiet, nodding when expected, withdrawing when necessary. Inside, something shifted. Not pain, not yet. Awareness. I understood then why his confidence had grown so sharp, so unshakable. He believed he had already replaced me in every way that counted. By the end of that chapter of my life, I knew something was deeply wrong. I just hadn't admitted it out loud. Silence still felt safer than truth, even as the cost of staying quiet grew heavier with every passing day. What I didn't realize was that my silence wasn't protecting him anymore. It was protecting me. I didn't feel betrayed at first. I felt erased. It started with the smallest things, the kind that seem petty if you say them out loud. A folder moved from my desk to his. A document I remembered placing carefully now missing, later reappearing somewhere else without explanation. Drawers reorganized, shelves cleared, pieces of our shared life quietly rearranged as if my presence were an inconvenience rather than a constant. When I asked about it, he waved it off. Practical changes, efficiency, temporary solutions. His answers were calm, reasonable, delivered with the same tone he used when explaining things to people he believed wouldn't understand the bigger picture. I was being managed. Decisions began happening in my absence. Not emergencies, not sudden crises, planned things, thought-out things. I would come home and hear about them afterward, always framed as already settled. He spoke in conclusions, not conversations. I noticed how often her name appeared alongside these decisions, how frequently he referenced her perspective as validation. She agreed it made sense, he'd say. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was disoriented. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for the moment where I had opted out without realizing it. Had I said this was fine? Had I implied consent? Or had silence simply become easier for everyone involved? There was a day I went looking for something important. Not sentimental, practical. A document tied to our finances that I knew exactly where I had stored it. When I couldn't find it, I asked him. He hesitated, just a second too long, then said he had moved it somewhere safer. Safer from what, I wondered, or from whom? He didn't offer to show me where it was. He told me it was handled. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The realization didn't come with panic, it came with clarity. I started paying attention differently. I stopped asking questions meant to reassure me, and began listening for patterns instead. His distance wasn't random, his schedule wasn't chaotic. His explanations weren't incomplete by accident. They were curated. When I lined everything up in my mind, it formed something coherent, something intentional. The money, the family involvement, her growing presence, my diminishing role. This wasn't a series of mistakes, it was a strategy. Oddly, the fear I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt calm. The calmness surprised me at first. I had spent months doubting myself, wondering if I was imagining things, if stress had made me suspicious. Now that the pattern was clear, the confusion lifted. I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I was finally seeing it. That clarity changed the way I moved through my days. I didn't confront him. Not then. I thought about it, of course. I imagined the conversation. I could already hear his responses. The way he would frame everything as a misunderstanding. The way he would question my tone instead of addressing my concerns. I understood something important in that moment. Confrontation without leverage would only accelerate whatever he was planning. An unexpected voice confirmed what I already knew. A friend, someone who had known me long before my marriage, commented casually that I seemed different. Quieter, more guarded. When I shrugged it off, she didn't push. She simply said, "That doesn't sound like a partnership." She wasn't accusing, she wasn't dramatic, she was observing. Hearing it from someone outside the situation was like having a mirror held up to my life. I could no longer pretend this was normal. This wasn't compromise, it was displacement. I began watching instead of reacting. I paid attention to timelines, to when decisions were made and who was involved. I noted how often his family spoke with certainty about things I hadn't been consulted on. I noticed how comfortable she was moving through spaces that had once felt private to me. Most of all, I noticed how careful he was around me now. Not cautious, exactly. Calculated. He believed I was still unsure, still doubting myself, still unwilling to disrupt the balance he had created. That assumption became my protection. I stopped filling silences, stopped justifying my presence. I listened, observed, and waited. Each day made the picture clearer. Each quiet moment confirmed what I had already accepted. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't failing as a wife. I was being erased deliberately. Once I named it, everything changed. The fear I had carried dissolved into resolve. I didn't need answers from him anymore. I didn't need validation from his family or explanations from anyone else. I needed time. Time to understand how far this had gone. Time to see what they believed they had secured. Time to prepare for what would come next. I made a decision then, one I didn't announce or explain. I would not disappear quietly. I would not fight blindly. and I would not confront him until I understood exactly what he stood to lose. For the first time in months, I slept without doubt. The truth was no longer something I was chasing. It was something I was holding. The morning everything finally broke felt ordinary enough to be dangerous. We moved around each other with polite efficiency, the way strangers do when they know each other's habits too well. Coffee brewed, doors opened and closed. He spoke to me like someone careful not to start a fire, and I responded the same way. On the surface, nothing was wrong. Underneath it, everything already was. I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. That need had burned itself out weeks earlier. What remained was a quiet detachment, the kind that comes when you stop hoping a situation will correct itself. I had already accepted that whatever happened next wouldn't be fixed with apologies. The confrontation wasn't planned. That's the part that surprised me. It came from something small, a comment he made while scrolling through his phone, dismissing a concern I raised about a decision that directly affected our finances. He didn't look at me when he answered. He didn't pause to consider. He simply waved the issue away as if my involvement were optional. I asked him calmly why I hadn't been included. The room went still. He looked up then, irritation flashing across his face, not guilt. "We've been over this," he said. "You're overthinking again." There it was, not denial, not explanation, redirection. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of anything specific. I asked a second question, quieter than the first. When did my opinion stop mattering? His response came fast, sharper this time. He told me I was being emotional, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that I didn't understand the pressure he was under. Each word landed with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this narrative before. Then something shifted. His tone hardened, losing the pretense of patience. He spoke about authority, about responsibility, about how decisions needed to be made by people who could handle them. He implied that I had become a distraction, that my role was to support, not interfere. I felt shock but not sadness. The sadness had already passed. What I felt instead was clarity. That was the moment I understood how he saw me now. Not as a partner, not even as an obstacle, as something temporary, replaceable. He didn't say her name, but he didn't need to. Her presence was woven into everything he referenced, every justification he offered. When he mentioned how someone else understood the demands of his work, how others didn't complicate things, I knew exactly who he meant. She was no longer hidden. The threat came next, though he probably didn't think of it that way. He warned me not to cause problems, not to make things difficult. He reminded me, casually, of how much influence he had, how messy things could get if I pushed back. Money, connections, legal realities. He said it like advice, not intimidation. It was meant to scare me into silence. For a brief moment it worked. Fear rose, sharp and instinctive. I imagined losing everything I had built, being painted as unstable, being erased completely. And then the fear broke. It didn't explode, it dissolved. I realized with surprising calm that he needed my compliance far more than I needed his approval. His confidence depended on my silence. His plans required my inaction. The moment I stopped trying to be agreeable, his control would weaken. I looked at him then, really looked, and responded in a way he wasn't expecting. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't defend myself, I apologized. The word hung between us, heavy and misleading. His shoulders relaxed immediately. The tension drained from his face. He had won, he thought. The threat had worked. The conversation was over. He didn't see the calculation behind my silence. From that point on, I played the role he wanted me to play. I disengaged. I stopped asking questions. I stopped reacting to decisions. I nodded, agreed, retreated. I let him believe the danger had passed. Inside, I was no longer afraid. I watched him grow more comfortable, more careless. I watched the way he spoke more freely once he thought I was subdued. I listened to the assumptions he made about my weakness, my dependence, my reluctance to fight. He underestimated me completely. That was the last time he spoke to me that way. Not because I confronted him again, but because I no longer needed to. The dynamic had shifted, even if he didn't realize it yet. Fear had kept me quiet before. Now preparation replaced it. I wasn't planning revenge, not in the way people imagine it. I wasn't plotting emotional destruction or dramatic confrontation. I was preparing to protect myself, to reclaim ground that had been taken without my consent. And for the first time since everything began to unravel, I felt steady. Not because I was safe. Because I was ready. I moved through the days that followed with deliberate quiet. At home, I became exactly what they expected me to be. Agreeable, uncurious, emotionally distant in a way that looked like defeat. I stopped asking about schedules, stopped reacting to changes. If something was decided without me, I accepted it without comment. If my presence was overlooked, I made myself smaller. It wasn't an act I enjoyed, but it was one I could maintain. What they didn't see was how closely I was watching. When you stop seeking reassurance, you start noticing patterns. I paid attention to the way he relaxed now that he believed the threat had passed. His tone softened. His guard lowered. He spoke more freely, assuming I wouldn't understand the implications of what he was saying even if I heard it. They had decided who I was, dependent, emotional, unprepared. Their certainty made them careless. I hadn't lost my skills when I married him. I had simply set them aside. Organization, analysis, documentation. I had always been good at seeing systems, at understanding how pieces fit together when others focused only on the surface. Those instincts hadn't disappeared. They had been waiting. I began applying them quietly. I didn't snoop. I didn't dig. I didn't touch anything that would leave a trace. I observed. I listened. I noted dates, conversations, shifts in behavior. When something didn't align, I marked it mentally and waited. People who think they're safe repeat their mistakes. Soon enough, inconsistencies appeared. Small ones at first. A timeline that didn't quite match. An expense justified by one explanation one week and a different one the next. References to meetings that didn't line up with the calendar he shared. I didn't confront him, I didn't react. I followed the trail they left behind. One evening, while he was distracted by a call, I noticed a document left open on his screen longer than he realized. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't scream guilt, but it confirmed something I had suspected. There were plans being made that didn't include me by design, not oversight. That was when I understood the scale of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It wasn't even just an affair. It was a coordinated effort to reposition my life without my consent, to reduce my role before removing it entirely. The realization didn't anger me, it sharpened me. I reached out to someone from my past, carefully, a former colleague who knew me before my marriage, before my withdrawal. I didn't tell them my story. I framed my questions hypothetically, asking about general protections, about common mistakes people make when they assume trust will hold. They listened, then they said something that stayed with me. Timing matters more than truth, they said. If you move too early, you lose leverage. I thanked them and ended the call without elaborating. I didn't need reassurance. I needed confirmation that my instincts were right. From there, I educated myself, quietly, methodically. I learned how divorces actually worked, not how they were portrayed. I learned how confidence can be manufactured and how easily it collapses when exposed to procedure. I learned why he felt so certain he would walk away untouched. And I learned where the blind spots were. Knowledge replaced fear completely. The more I understood, the calmer I became. I wasn't powerless. I had simply been uninformed. There was a difference, and it mattered. The first piece of real leverage arrived without fanfare. It wasn't a single document or dramatic discovery. It was a pattern, confirmed across multiple moments, pointing to intent rather than accident. Something that couldn't be explained away as miscommunication or coincidence. It didn't tell the whole story, but it told enough. Enough to prove that what was happening was deliberate. I understood then why he had warned me not to fight, why his confidence bordered on arrogance. He believed I wouldn't see the structure beneath the surface. He believed I would react emotionally, expose myself too early, and weaken my own position. I didn't. Instead, I waited. I let them believe they were in control. I let them move faster, take bigger risks, speak more freely. Confidence does that to people. It convinces them the outcome is inevitable. I didn't rush to feel victorious. I didn't celebrate progress. I stayed focused, patient, precise. Every day added clarity. Every careless comment added weight to what I already knew. By the time I finished preparing, I understood something important about myself. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was returning to someone I had always been, someone capable of standing still while others underestimated her. They thought I was disappearing. In reality, I was positioning myself. And once I had the leverage I needed, I knew the hardest part was already behind me. Power doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, unnoticed, especially by people who assume they already have it. I let them feel safe. At home, I remained distant but cooperative. The version of me they had decided was harmless. I agreed to changes without questions. I nodded through explanations that weren't meant for me. I didn't interrupt conversations that excluded me. I watched how quickly his shoulders relaxed once he believed I had accepted my place. He stopped being careful. Confidence has a way of loosening tongues. He began talking more freely again, less guarded about timelines and plans. He spoke as if I weren't really there, as if my presence had become part of the furniture. When he mentioned upcoming decisions, he spoke in terms of when, not if, everything would be finalized. His family reinforced that confidence. They spoke openly now, no longer bothering to lower their voices. I overheard comments about how smoothly things were going, how sensible it was to move quickly, how unnecessary it would be for me to complicate matters. No one corrected them, no one hesitated. They believed the outcome was locked in. A significant decision was made without me, exactly as I expected it would be. Not a small adjustment or minor change, but something structural, something that would have consequences if questioned later. He informed me afterward casually, as if sharing a piece of news rather than a shift in my own life. I responded calmly. I didn't ask for details. I didn't express concern. Inside, I recognized the value of what had just happened. Exclusion, when documented, becomes evidence. Their timeline began to accelerate after that. I noticed the language change. Soon became before long. Plans that had once been vague suddenly had dates attached to them. They weren't just confident anymore, they were rushing. That urgency told me more than any confession could have. I understood then why the divorce hearing date mattered so much to them, why there had been pressure to settle things quickly, why my silence was so important. They weren't simply ending a marriage, they were trying to secure something before scrutiny arrived. I continued to gather proof without touching anything. I didn't copy files or move documents. I didn't leave digital footprints. I listened. I remembered. I noted patterns, repetitions, contradictions. People who think they're untouchable repeat themselves. They assume no one is paying attention. I was. One evening, his mother spoke too freely while advising him on the phone. Her voice carried through the house, sharp with certainty. She referenced a conversation that hadn't included me, a decision she assumed was already finalized. When she noticed me nearby, she stopped mid-sentence, then laughed it off. It didn't matter, the damage was done. Their involvement was no longer implied, it was visible. I began to see how coordinated everything had been, not just between him and her but across the family. Information shared, strategies aligned, roles assigned. I wasn't just being sidelined by my husband, I was being managed by a group that had decided what my future would look like without consulting me. And they were doing it openly now. The final step came faster than I expected. He committed to an action that crossed a line, not emotionally, legally. Something that couldn't be undone quietly or explained away later. It was the kind of decision people make when they believe there will be no consequences. When he told me about it, he watched my face closely, looking for a reaction. I gave him none. I nodded. I told him I trusted his judgment. That was the moment the trap closed. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt a strange calm, the kind that arrives when you know there's nothing left to do but wait. Everything that needed to happen had already happened, carried out by their own hands. They had exposed themselves completely. From that point on, I did nothing to interfere. I didn't try to slow them down. I didn't warn them. I didn't protect them from their own momentum. I let them move forward exactly as they intended. Their confidence grew right up until the day of the hearing. By then, the trap was complete. Not because I had forced them into it, but because they had walked into it willingly, convinced that no one was watching, least of all me. I understood something then that changed the way I thought about power. It doesn't come from control, it comes from patience, from knowing when not to speak, from letting people reveal who they are when they think the outcome is guaranteed. As I prepared to walk back into the courtroom, I knew something they didn't. That room would be the first place they realized how wrong they had been. And when that realization came, there would be no way to take it back. The courthouse looked smaller than I remembered, like a building that had lost some of its authority under closer inspection. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted time to settle into the space. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Shoes echoed against polished floors. Conversations hummed quietly, contained, controlled. Everything about the place was designed to keep emotion at bay. He arrived later exactly as I expected. He walked in with confidence, his posture loose, almost relaxed. His lawyer followed closely, whispering something that made him nod. A moment later, she appeared beside him, composed and smiling, dressed carefully enough to signal seriousness without humility. They didn't look at me directly. They didn't need to. They believed this was procedural. His family filled the row behind them, settling in like spectators who had already seen the ending. His mother scanned the room with mild interest, her gaze passing over me without recognition. His sister leaned in to whisper something that made him smirk. I took my seat alone. The judge entered, and the room rose and fell again into stillness. The formality grounded me. This wasn't a conversation. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a process governed by rules, not confidence. His lawyer spoke first. The story they presented was clean, efficient, and incomplete. A narrative of mutual separation, of reasonable decisions, of a marriage that had simply run its course. He emphasized cooperation, resolution, and the importance of moving forward without unnecessary conflict. He never mentioned timelines. He never mentioned coordination. He never mentioned intent. As he spoke, I watched the judge closely, not for reactions, but for rhythm. When judges hear something they've heard 100 times before, they listen differently. Their expressions stay neutral, but their attention sharpens in specific places. I saw it when the lawyer glossed over a detail too quickly, a flicker of interest, a note made in the margin. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't look at them. I addressed the court directly, my voice steady, factual. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth as simply as possible, laying out a timeline rather than a story. Dates, decisions, exclusions. I spoke about when my involvement ended and how quickly decisions followed. I explained the pattern, not the emotion behind it. I referenced moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a clear progression. I watched his lawyer's posture change. He leaned forward slightly, alert now. This wasn't what they had prepared for. When I finished, the judge asked questions, not emotional ones, clarifying ones, precise ones. Each answer I gave was brief, direct, supported by consistency rather than proof I needed to introduce myself. That consistency mattered. The judge turned back to the file. Pages turned. The sound felt louder this time. He paused, went back, reread something. His expression didn't change, but the pace slowed. He wasn't skimming anymore, he was verifying. Across the aisle, I felt the shift before I saw it. My husband straightened in his chair. His smile faded into something tighter, less certain. His mistress crossed and uncrossed her legs, adjusting in a way that betrayed nerves she hadn't bothered to hide before. His mother stopped whispering. The confidence in the room thinned. The judge asked his lawyer to clarify a point, a minor one, on the surface. A date. The lawyer answered smoothly, without hesitation. The judge nodded, then asked a follow-up question that narrowed the margin for interpretation. The lawyer paused this time. Not long, just long enough. That was when I knew. The narrative they had built relied on assumption rather than alignment, on confidence rather than verification. They hadn't expected the timeline to matter. They hadn't expected questions. They hadn't expected me to speak the way I did. The judge leaned back slightly, hands folded, and looked at the file again. The room waited. Even the air seemed to slow. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. What I felt was certainty. This was no longer about who believed whom. It was about process, about sequence, about actions and consequences. The judge hadn't reached a conclusion yet. That much was clear. But the foundation they thought was solid had cracked. And for the first time since this began, they understood something I had known all along. Confidence doesn't win cases. Preparation does. As the judge prepared to speak again, I kept my eyes forward, my hands still, my expression neutral. Whatever came next would be decided by facts, not fear. And that was exactly where I wanted to be. The judge didn't speak right away. He studied the file in silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable. I could feel the tension ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable. Papers rustled softly. Someone in the gallery shifted in their seat. My husband's lawyer cleared his throat, then stopped himself. The confidence they had carried in with them was gone now, replaced by something brittle. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked up, not at me, but at my husband. His gaze lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, measuring. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, controlled, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. He asked a single question about intent. Not about feelings, not about morality, about timing and purpose. My husband answered quickly, too quickly. He spoke in generalities, leaning on phrases that sounded practiced. He talked about efficiency, about inevitability, about how things had simply unfolded. The judge nodded once, then asked him to clarify something small. A decision date, a sequence, a reason a particular step had been taken when it was. The answer this time was slower. I watched as my husband glanced at his lawyer just briefly, the way people do when they're searching for a lifeline. The lawyer stepped in smoothly, offering an explanation that sounded plausible on its own but didn't quite fit with what had already been said. The judge didn't challenge it directly. He didn't argue. He simply turned back to the file and compared. That was when the silence returned, heavier than before. I could see the moment the realization spread across their faces, one by one. His mistress stopped smiling entirely, her expression flattening into something guarded. His mother's posture stiffened, hands tightening in her lap. His sister leaned back, folding her arms, no longer whispering. They had expected judgment. They hadn't expected scrutiny. The judge began to speak again, this time outlining what he saw. Not accusations, observations, a timeline that didn't align with the narrative presented. Decisions that appeared coordinated rather than incidental. Actions taken before certain discussions had supposedly occurred. He wasn't condemning anyone yet. He was dismantling assumptions. Each sentence landed quietly but firmly, stripping away the certainty they had built their case on. My husband's lawyer tried to interject once, gently, but the judge raised a hand, not angrily, just enough to signal that he wasn't finished. I didn't look at my husband then. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in him without seeing it. The relaxed posture was gone, the easy confidence replaced by something tight and defensive. He sat straighter now, alert in a way that spoke of danger finally recognized. The judge asked one final clarifying question, this time directly to me. I answered simply. No embellishment, no emotion, just confirmation. The judge nodded again, slower this time, then closed the file. The sound was unmistakable. When he spoke, his tone changed. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't dramatic. It was definitive. He explained that based on the information presented, there were issues that could not be ignored, that certain assumptions about fairness and cooperation no longer held, that the case, as framed by one side, did not reflect the full reality of the situation. My husband exhaled sharply, a sound he probably didn't realize he made. The judge didn't announce a final ruling yet. He didn't need to. What he did instead was shift the ground beneath them, outlining the next steps, the considerations that would now factor into the outcome. Protections, reviews, a recalibration of expectations. Everything they thought was settled was suddenly open again. I watched as the weight of that reality settled in. His mistress stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, no trace of earlier confidence remaining. His family looked stunned, as if the rules of a game they thought they understood had just changed without warning. My husband finally looked at me. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, just disbelief. As if he were seeing me for the first time, not as the quiet, compliant figure he had dismissed, but as someone he had never fully understood. I didn't meet his gaze for long. I wasn't interested in his reaction. This moment wasn't about him realizing anything. It was about consequences catching up to decisions made in the dark. The judge concluded the session calmly, methodically, setting a new course that no one in his camp had prepared for. When he stood, the room rose again, slower this time, heavier. As people began to file out, the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter from earlier felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to another version of this story. I gathered my things quietly and stood. No one stopped me, no one spoke. As I walked toward the exit, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was over, but because the truth was finally out in the open, no longer something I carried alone. They had walked into that courtroom believing the ending was already written. They were wrong. And for the first time, they knew it. I didn't feel victorious when I stepped out of the courthouse. What I felt was free. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp enough to clear whatever fog remained in my mind. People passed by without noticing me, each of them carrying their own worries, their own private battles. The world hadn't changed because of what happened inside that room. I had. Behind me, I heard raised voices, not shouting but strained, controlled anger trying and failing to stay contained. I didn't turn around. I already knew who was speaking and why. Whatever unraveling they were experiencing now was no longer my responsibility. For years, I had carried the weight of being underestimated. I had learned to live inside silence, to shrink my reactions, to question my own instincts. Walking away from that building, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had never been weak. I had been patient. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no late-night confessions, no apologies worth hearing. Lawyers spoke, papers moved, processes unfolded slowly, deliberately, exactly as they were supposed to. The same people who once rushed with confidence now hesitated, careful with every step. They had learned what happens when certainty collides with facts. I took my time reclaiming my life, not all at once, not recklessly, piece by piece. I returned to routines that belonged to me, not ones shaped around someone else's expectations. I rebuilt my sense of direction without asking permission, without explaining myself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. There were moments when anger surfaced, brief flashes of it, sharp and tempting. I let them pass. Anger had already done enough damage in that marriage. It didn't get a say in what came next. What surprised me most was the peace. Not relief, not triumph, peace. The kind that comes when you stop trying to prove your worth to people who benefit from doubting it. The kind that settles in when your choices are no longer reactions, but intentions. I thought back to the courtroom, to that moment when the judge spoke and everything shifted. One sentence, calm, measured, enough to change the direction of an entire story. That sentence didn't give me power. It revealed where the power had been all along. I had assumed for too long that justice had to be loud to be effective, that strength needed an audience to matter. I know better now. The most decisive moments happen quietly, when preparation meets opportunity and truth no longer needs to shout. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because I know how easy it is to lose yourself when someone else controls the narrative, how tempting it is to stay quiet, to wait, to hope things will resolve on their own. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the only way forward is through patience, clarity, and the courage to let others underestimate you until it's too late for them to recover. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt erased, sidelined, or dismissed in a way that made you doubt yourself, I want you to know something. Silence doesn't mean surrender. Calm doesn't mean weakness. And waiting doesn't mean you've lost. It may mean you're preparing. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar or seen it happen to someone you care about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter more than you think, and sharing them might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, about tables turning when no one expects it, make sure you stay here with me. Subscribe, like, and keep listening. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's walking away with your dignity intact, while the people who laughed realize too late that the ending was never in their control.